today. It looks like folks are still in the midst of joining, but we'll start with our sort of introductory remarks and then turn it over to our speakers. My name is Tara Britton. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Center for Community Solutions. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit that aims to improve health, social, and economic conditions through nonpartisan research, policy analysis, communications, and advocacy. You'll see there our policy priorities and our website and how to engage with us on Twitter. I wanted to, again, thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank Advocates for Ohio's Future for partnering with Community Solutions over the last several weeks and for several weeks to come on these Friday webinars about how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting various health and human service and education sectors. So we've been hosting these webinars over the last few weeks and have touched on a variety of topics: Medicaid, the sort of county job and family service system. We've talked about, we've had some national partners to talk about how the federal legislation is impacting what's going on in Ohio. And then in the coming weeks, we're going to talk about behavioral health, developmental disabilities, childcare, several other topics. So thanks for all who have joined us, and we look forward to you continuing to join us for these series and hope that they're really helpful in understanding the impact of the pandemic in the state and to many of the groups that we all work with on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to introduce Advocates for Ohio's Future as well as our speakers. Just logistics-wise, we're going to hold questions until the end, so please submit those through the chat box. Danny Carlson, the communications director at Community Solutions, will be helping us manage those questions, and we'll try to get them submitted to folks in the order that they were submitted to the chat. If we can't get to all of them, which has happened a few weeks, we'll try to get those out to our speakers and circle back with answers if that is possible. This will also be, the slides will be posted to the Community Solutions website right after the conclusion of the webinar. We are going to probably wait to put the full recording up until early next week, just because I think folks are heading out early and want to make sure people have time to, more time to spend with their families over the holiday weekend. So we'll get this recording up early next week and make sure that we're able to share it with all of you. So I will turn it over to Kelsey. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tara, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelsey Bergfeld. I'm the Coalition Manager for Advocates for Ohio's Future. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of a wide-ranging health and human service policy, advocacy, and provider organizations from the state and local level. We work together to strengthen families and communities through public funding and policies that support health and human services, early childcare and education, especially as it relates to lifting up the most vulnerable among us. And we are very happy to continue hosting these Friday webinars with us, Community Solutions. And once again, we will continue to bring you the great information from policy experts and those folks on the ground, helping those with providing services and making sure that those who do need assistance during this time have what they need to successfully move out of this pandemic and back into the community as safely as possible. So we are very excited today to be joined by three education advocates and experts. First off, we will have Melissa Cropper. She's the president of the Ohio Federation of Teachers, also the Secretary Treasurer of the Ohio AFL-CIO. We have Sarah Kilpatrick. She is the Executive Director of the Ohio Conference of the American Association of University Professors. And then we will have Daryl Johnson joining us as well. He's the Director of Legislation at the Ohio Federation of Teachers to help with questions and chip in whenever he feels ready. So Melissa, we are going to go ahead and get started, and feel free to kick us off when you're ready.
Thank you, Kelsey and Tara, for hosting this conversation and including education as part of the conversation. And thank you to all of you who are watching and participating today. Of course, education is a topic that concerns not only our teachers, but this COVID crisis has impacted across the board anyone who has children or has responsible for taking care of children in any way. It kind of threw us all for a loop at the beginning. And we know it's been a struggle for our educators, whether they're teachers or paraprofessionals or support staff in some way, to flip on a dime to delivering instruction and doing education in a different way. But it's equally been a challenge to parents, grandparents, anyone who has responsibility for children, to try to figure out how do you work from home yourself potentially, and also keep your child up to speed on their education work. So it's been quite a challenge all the way around. And I think for the most part, we've all worked well together to make that happen. But the question now is, what is next fall going to look like, and how are we going to make sure that children continue to be educated next fall? Because the one thing that became highly, highly clear during this crisis, and it's not new to probably any of us who are on this call, because we've all been advocates for children for a long time, but I think what has really been highlighted is the inequities that exist in our education system. And now that those are out there, I think we have a real opportunity to really try to address those inequities and those social determinants of education and try to make a change in our system. So as we look ahead to next year, and the one thing I want to make clear right off the bat is nothing is certain right now. There are a lot of conversations happening, but the challenge for us in education is that we don't know what the fall is going to look like. We don't know if we're going to be back in school full time, if we're going to be shut down completely, or if we're going to have some kind of hybrid model. So we're all in this space of trying to figure out how do we deal with each one of those contingencies. But so we're kind of approaching it from, let's look at the big picture and let's figure out how we might have to adjust in each of these different situations. So we do know that one of the key things is going to be safety. So AFT, our parent union at the national level, recently put out a guide to reopening America that include reopening in schools in it. And some of the key pieces they put in here as far as safety issues in particular for restarting is, one, how are we going to maintain physical distancing? And actually the recommendation from the national level is that we shouldn't even actually be thinking about going to school until we have seen a decline in the number of new cases for at least 14 consecutive days. So of course, we've got all summer before school will start again. Hopefully we just see that decline, but we do think that, we shut down schools when there are very few cases. We don't think we should be looking at reopening schools until we see that there is a decline in those cases. We also think that there needs to be in place the infrastructure and resources to test, trace, isolate new cases, and figuring out, how do we have some herd immunity and all those big challenges, those big questions that are out there. AOT is recommending that we deploy the public health tools that prevent the virus's spread and align them with education strategies that meet the needs of students. We are going to be relying heavily upon our public health experts. I think we're very fortunate here in Ohio to have Dr. Amy Acton making these decisions. And of course, we're going to be relying upon her information for how we proceed. Another one of our key tenets is we really think it's important to involve workers, unions, parents, and communities in all this planning. We know that each workplace, each community faces its own unique challenges. So when we're looking at not only reopening a school, but also what does education look like in that school, it's critical that we're listening to the people who are most impacted. So the people who teach and work in the system, the students, and then the people who take care of those students. And then this is this last bullet point, really big bullet point, is that we have to invest in recovery. We cannot forfeit the future of our children or of our communities. So we're very pleased that Congress passed the HEROES Act, but we also know that we need to get this through the Senate in order for us to be successful with any kind of reopening. So if we could go to the next slide. So what might school look like in the fall? Again, this is speculation, but these are the kinds of things that we are looking at. How would we physically distance students? What does that look like in a classroom? What does that look like on a school bus? How does that play out at recess, lunchtime? How does it play out in sports, extracurriculars, etc.? Screening, what kind of screening measures will we put into place? Like doing temperature checks before students come to school, or doing temperature checks as they come into the school? What kind of school-based programming and organizing might need to happen? And then what kind of personal protective equipment and sanitation might we need to have? Again, as everyone has struggled with personal protective equipment, this is going to be critical again when we're reopening schools. And especially when we know that, we get reports oftentimes that in the past our schools have struggled with even having enough soap in their bathrooms and stuff to provide for hand washing. So we know we're going to have to go even beyond that. So what kind of sanitation type things we're going to have around, and do we have the staffing capacity to be able to keep our schools clean? So some actions that we might be able to take are, one, have smaller class sizes. It's really difficult to social distance if you have a class of 25 students. With the way our schools are built, if you have 10 to 15 students, that might be more practical. Split scheduling. This again could have all different kinds of manifestations to this. We could be looking at, some students come in the morning, some come in the afternoon, or some students come on certain days of the week, other students come on other days of the week. It could be that our most high-risk students or most at-need students are learning on campus and others are learning at home. These are all conversations that are taking place within our locals and at the state level. Monitoring access to school facilities, so making sure we're not only taking care of the students, but we're monitoring who is coming in and out of the buildings at all times so we can limit the amount of exposure that comes in through the doors. Looking at transportation, how to get people there. There's a lot of conversation around if you physically distance on a bus, you might only be able to get 11 or 12 students on a bus. If you have people from the same family on that bus, you could get more because they could sit together. But again, how do we actually even get students to school? And then things like staggered lunch and meal times, or having meals within classrooms instead of going to a cafeteria, etc. Next slide. We're also looking at, again, special student populations, training, what type of training will our staff need? And again, this is just around the safety pieces, but what kind of training will staff, students, and parents need to have around how to use PPE, how to dispose of PPE, how to recognize risk factors, how to protect yourselves. Again, alternative plans for after school programming, space and time considerations, all these types of things are coming under consideration right now. So our next slide. So at a state level, ODE, the Ohio Department of Education, has been working with stakeholders to develop a discussion guide for for districts to look at. It really is seen as a discussion guide only. They're not coming out with restrictive measures around what schools have to do on the reopening of school. Where it might be the most prescriptive would be around the safety and health issues. There still is not a lot of clarity on exactly what decisions will be made from the states, from the governor, from Dr. Acton, and what decisions will be left to local measures. But we do know that this particular piece of a reopening plan will be more prescriptive than any other piece of a reopening plan. But then beyond that, the department is just putting out some discussion around some things you might want to consider when you're thinking about reopening schools. Like how are we going to assess where students are academically? What are we going to do to support literacy and numeracy, and how we're going to provide intervention strategies? What kind of professional development might teachers need? How do we take care of the social emotional learning and physical health of students? And how do we prioritize vulnerable students, including those who have disabilities or are homeless or ELL or in foster care and so on. At an OFT level, we are taking it even to another level, that we're working with our members to learn from what they have experienced this year and to think about what questions we also need to be asking. When these discussion guides are happening locally, what questions do we want to put on the table? Well, what questions will we put on the table? And we want to operate from a set of core beliefs. Any decision we make, we want it to be grounded in this is what we believe around education. So some of our core beliefs, and these are still in the process of being developed, so this is all still a very rough, raw draft, but we do believe that children deserve a well-rounded education that focuses not only on content in the core areas, but that allows students to really explore their passions and engage in learning. This is really important to us because we know that as budgets cuts start coming level, is to say, what can we cut and do we absolutely have to have? And then to go directly to, okay, well, we know we're tested in certain subjects, so we got to protect those subjects and maybe at the expense of others. And what we know as educators is that what engages students in learning, what keeps students interested in learning is often those other classes, whether it's choir, art, or some other, band, some other type of elective. If they don't have that as an incentive, then it's less likely that they're going to engage in learning. We also believe that children deserve equal access to a quality education, including whatever resources they need. Again, one of the things we've seen through this is that there's certainly been a gap in who has access to technology and who does not, whether there's access to devices or access to actually being able to get on the internet. And we believe that children have different learning styles and learning needs, so we have a responsibility to accommodate those needs. We believe firmly that the best learning takes place when children are in the classroom interacting with the teacher and other students. While remote learning serves us during this crisis, we also know that a lot is lost when students are just sitting in front of a computer isolated on their own learning. They miss out a lot on the socialization skills and the relationship building that happens. We also believe that every person in the system is important. We hear a lot about the work that teachers are doing, but equally important are the paraprofessionals who often are from the same community as the students and can identify with the students on a deeper level, as well as the bus drivers, school nurses, and other support staff. And we know that our public schools are the lifeline for many of our students, and that it goes well beyond the academics, but also about providing food, safety, health, etc. And that's, again, is one of our very, very core beliefs. We believe that the best teaching, learning, and working conditions are achieved whenever issues and solutions are jointly identified and collectively bargained. Again, we heard when we testified before the Senate the other day, the administrative groups testified before us. And again, their immediate piece was, and which again is their responsibility as management. Obviously, they're going to think about the budget and the money pieces of it. And they go immediately to, we're going to have to cut, we need to get around the collective bargaining agreement, et cetera. Whereas our approach is, hey, let's create a vision for education. Let's determine what it is our students need. And then let's figure out from what they need, how much money needs to come into it, and put pressure on our legislature and upon Congress and our senators and everyone else to provide for that. Let's not give them an easy out by saying we can cut certain things. Okay, next slide. I want to wrap up my piece because I know I'm going a little, I don't want to go long here, but basically we know the CARES Act has already been passed and we're grateful for that. The CARES Act provided $440.3 million in emergency relief funds. This has been very helpful for our districts. Unfortunately, we also know that within the CARES Act was a provision that money had to be shared with private schools. So many of our districts throughout the state, even though they got money from the CARES Act, by the time they deducted money that went out to vouchers and then also deducted cuts that were made to them by the governor, they ended up in the hole. I use as an example our Cleveland Heights district, which was disproportionately impacted by vouchers. They received about $1.9 million in CARES Act money. Over 700,000 of that went out to private schools. Another 1.4 million or so was cut by the governor. So they actually ended up in the hole $215,000 at a time when the needs of their students are higher than ever. So next slide. There's money in there for higher education too, but since Sarah's going to be talking about higher education, I will leave that to Sarah to talk about the CARES Act and what's happening in higher education. And then there's some discretionary money in there for the governor to use. So we can go on to the next slide. And this slide, which I'll let you look at again later, are some other budget cuts that some budget cuts that have already come down through the governor and where some of them came from. Again, we want to emphasize that the cuts that have happened so far were only for the rest of this fiscal year. This does not even begin to touch into the cuts that are going to take place next year. And then the next slide, and you can keep going, Kelsey, to the next slide. So here's what we know for sure. We know that we need federal help with funding. We know that safety is going to be critical in making decisions about what the future looks like in education. We know that whatever happens next year with education, it will not look like it did, like we did before the pandemic. But we also know that out of crisis comes opportunity. So we need to be proactive and visionary about how to educate students. And next, Kelsey. We know that we need to be using our public dollars to fund public schools, not private schools. And that goes back to what I was just saying to you. We know that we need to address the social determinants of education, poverty, trauma, mental health, healthcare, all the things that are also social determinants and healthcare access and other pieces. We know that we need to create a safe school environment and that we need to establish equitable funding for our public institutions. And at that, I will stop and turn it over to Sarah for the higher ed piece of this.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and thanks, Melissa, for your presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And just to make sure, can somebody give me some indication that everything's showing up correctly? Okay, thanks, Melissa. Okay, well, just to give you a little sense of our association, so the Ohio Conference AAUP represents about 6,000 college and university faculty across the state at both public and private institutions, and I've been executive director for over 9 years now. And today I'm going to talk about higher education before, during, and after COVID-19, because I think we need to look at this holistically to really understand the problems that we're facing currently in higher ed. So to start, I think we need to talk about why public colleges and universities exist. And higher education, of course, used to exist exclusively for the wealthy. You had, the upper echelon of society sending their kids to, the elite universities, and then, states began to see the value in education and started to establish public colleges and universities to educate the masses. And state leaders believed in funding a liberal arts education as well as job training as a pathway to the middle class. And because of the value of having an educated citizenry in all aspects of life, of course, you want to have educated citizens because it's, leads to less crime. It means that people are more educated when they vote and so on and so forth. And public higher education used to be fully funded by the state. We used to have no tuition at public colleges and universities, and typically students only had to pay a small amount in fees and maybe only a few $100s at that. And we know that the cost has gone up significantly over the years. And of course, there is a connection between tax cuts and budget cuts. Underfunding of education is a manufactured crisis. Tax cuts have led to loss of revenue at the states and have then led to various budget cuts, whether it be to K-12 or higher ed or other things. But higher education has really been a prime target for budget cuts at the state level over the years. There have been so many budgets that have been balanced on the back of higher education, and it's sort of seen as, well, we can afford to cut it because then institutions can just raise tuition. And if you look at any graphs of state funding versus tuition costs, they're mirror images of each other. As state funding has gone down, tuition has increased. And as a result of these budget cuts, institutions have adopted more of a corporate model in higher education. And so we start to see, more top administrators making a lot of money in this sort of top-down model instead of the collegial model that we're used to in higher education. And it's caused a whole lot of problems because the corporate model doesn't fit the nonprofit educational mission of higher education. We'll get to some of the problems of the corporate model has developed in the next few slides. But first, I want to talk about the SSI funding formula. So SSI is State Chair of Instruction, and this is the main funding source from the state to colleges and universities. And open access institutions rely more heavily on this support than other institutions. And what I mean by open access is those institutions that aren't selective. So Ohio State University, for example, has selective admissions, whereas community colleges and other universities have open access, and they therefore rely more on SSI money than others. And it used to be the case that SSI was based on enrollment, but under Governor Kasich, the funding formula, and so the state has moved from an opportunity model to give students a chance to earn that bachelor's degree to one that's based on performance. And so institutions have to make sure that, you know, students are completing courses, students are graduating, because that's how they get paid now. So to show you how SSI has changed just over the last 15 years, and this is adjusted for inflation, you know, we're going to be spending less in fiscal year 2021 than we did in fiscal year 2006 on State Chair of Instruction when you adjust for inflation. So we're spending even less today than we were 15 years ago, and obviously that's not a sustainable model. And you can sort of see the jump that happened under the Strickland administration. You know, that was with you know, federal help that we were able to get more money into SSI. But you can see, you know, the highs and lows over the last 15 years, and certainly if you go back any further, you will see, you know, just how the spending, you know, really hasn't been there for higher education over the years, unfortunately. And while certainly the you know, state spending has been a problem over the years and has, you know, directly led into increase in tuition, you know, there's also the issue of the way that colleges and universities spend their money. So one thing that I like to ask people when I'm having conversations about colleges and universities is, how much do you think that colleges and universities spend on employing faculty? And I'm talking about all faculty, from adjuncts to full-time tenured faculty, and not just their salary, but salary and benefits. And people are always surprised at the answer. So for two-year community colleges, it's about 45% on average. For four-year universities, 25% on averages. So you know, I think that it's shocking that, you know, when people think of colleges and universities, you think, oh, this is, you know, so faculty heavy that would be the majority of the cost, but it's just not. And one thing that we see, which is, you know, disturbing development, is the rise in part-time and adjunct labor. We see that when tenured faculty retire, for example, instead of putting a new tenure track position out there, we're seeing that they're hiring, you know, one or two adjuncts to fulfill the teaching responsibilities of that professor. And part-time faculty do not get any benefits. They are paid a fraction of what full-time professors are paid. And it's not the same conditions for part-time faculty. They don't have any office space. Students, you know, then therefore can't go to them for office hours and things like that. And so this has been, you know, I would say what is a negative development in higher education over the last 20 years. And so, of course, the question becomes, where do the other 55% and 75% of the budgets go? The first part is administration. Administrative bloat has been a big problem in higher ed for really the last 30 years. If you look at some of the data, it'll show that administration over the last 10 years has ballooned almost 200% at institutions, while faculty salaries have increased about 10%. And then when you adjust that for inflation, faculty salaries have remained nearly stagnant. So there is a lot of administration at our institutions, and a lot of that administration is paid very highly. We don't think that you necessarily need to have 7 vice presidents, and that there could be a lot of reductions in administration that need to take place at our institutions. Also, and this isn't the case for community colleges so much, but really for universities, that athletics is a big money suck. You know, most people don't know that Ohio State University is the only university in the state that has a self-sustaining athletic program, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. Also, construction projects. If you've been on any college or university campus, really, in the last 10 years, you see lots of construction going on, and it's great to have new buildings and such, but it means that universities have nearly doubled their debt in the last 10, 15 years because of the numerous construction projects, and this gets passed on to students in the form of student fees, and then this ultimately becomes student debt. And then, of course, it takes a lot to run a university, and so the other portions of the budgets go to staff and maintenance and just, simply keeping the lights on. So to talk a little bit about athletic subsidy and the cost to students. So this was a piece that was done by the Cleveland Plain Dealer a few months ago, and you can see that universities in Ohio lost $192 million from their athletic programs last year. And that has to be covered by student fees, state subsidy, and tuition dollars. And so we're actually, taxpayers are funding college athletics. And if you look at the cost per student, this is what students at these campuses are paying every year to subsidize athletics. And so they're not small amounts, they're very hefty amounts. And again, this, ends up becoming student debt because it compounds and students can't afford this. And so we think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And you may have seen that, during this pandemic crisis, that there have been some universities that have eliminated some athletic programs because they just simply cannot afford the cost anymore. And I wanted to also touch on College Credit Plus. And College Credit Plus used to be called Post-Secondary Enrollment Options. And this was a program where, very bright high school students who have excelled in high school and have showed that they were ready to take the next steps and move on to college courses were able to, step away from the high school and then go take some courses at their local college or university. But this has become vastly expanded into this College Credit Plus program because instead of actually just funding higher education, the state has said, well, we'll just reduce the time it takes to get a degree. And so this whole time to degree mantra has replaced the idea of a quality education. And we think that the best thing a high school can do is prepare students for college, not try to substitute for it. And through the College Credit Plus program, you have a lot of high school teachers being diverted to teach college level courses. And really the program has been so vastly expanded, we haven't even really had a chance to see the impact of it. But we do know that one of the impacts has been the revenue losses for colleges and universities. And this is because these lower level courses are the bread and butter of our colleges and universities, and they're now being siphoned away by the College Credit Plus program. And so at a time when colleges and universities already are dealing with financial problems, this has caused an even larger burden for them. So in terms of the impact of COVID-19, I should of course mention that faculty really had to move quickly to adjust their courses for online learning. There are students that don't have access to computers off campus, and so there was a lot of work that had to be done for those students to adapt materials. And so it was, and they had to do this, really just within a week or two, and this was very difficult, but faculty rose to the occasion, as much as they could. But I think that it's important to understand that COVID-19 did not single-handedly cause financial problems at our institutions of higher education, but rather it exacerbated existing ones. I mean, we do need to acknowledge that a lot of institutions did lose millions of dollars in refunds to students. Some students withdrew from their courses, especially for universities. Institutions had to reimburse them for meal plans, parking, things like that. And Governor DeWine announced a couple of weeks ago that he was cutting $110 million from higher education for fiscal year 2020, ending at the end of June. And so, of course, that adds to the problem. And it's not surprising that summer enrollments are down. Everything's online right now, and you see summer isn't a popular time for students to take classes anyway, but it's even down further because of what's happening. And we just don't know what fall is going to look like. I think that we do know that unless we're able to be on campus in the fall in some way, that there's probably going to be a drop in enrollment. But at this point, because there's still so many unknowns, financial unknowns. But even though there are so many things that we still don't know about what things are going to look like in the fall and really overall what the financial impact is going to be, there are some pretty sweeping and drastic changes that are already being implemented or proposed at our institutions. And so, you see faculty and staff terminations, program and college eliminations. And so these are, like I said, drastic changes that are being proposed and with very little information. And so, what we're asking is, for institutions to sort of step back, especially when it comes to eliminating the core academic mission. We don't want to gut academics because we don't know if we'll ever get, those faculty back or ever get those programs back. And unfortunately, we often see that the first programs to go are the diversity programs like African American Studies and Women and Gender Studies. So as Melissa mentioned, there was some federal aid to colleges and universities in the CARES Act, but it was about 1/5 of what colleges and universities said that they would need in order to weather this storm. So again, like Melissa said, we need another federal relief bill that includes more unrestricted aid to colleges and universities if we're going to survive this, if we're not going to have severe cuts like we're seeing being proposed and already implemented at many places. And also, like Melissa said, this is an opportunity. Colleges and universities must use this crisis as an opportunity to refocus resources on the academic mission. We just can't have bloated administrations anymore. We can't have athletic programs that siphon millions every year away from the academic mission. We need to really refocus and realize that our institutions exist to educate. And in terms of the future of Ohio higher ed, of course, there are going to be dangers of being on campus this fall, and we just don't know whether campuses are going to be open or not. What I'm hearing so far is that a lot of institutions are considering a hybrid model, especially for those who need to be in labs for the sciences. But especially with residential campuses, universities, they will become hotbeds if there aren't some accommodations made for residence halls and other congregating at institutions. So it's going to be a really difficult situation to navigate. But there are also the financial dangers of not being on campus and what that means if enrollment drops even further because students want to have that university experience and they're not able to be on campuses. And of course, what will colleges and universities look like after this financial fallout? Again, there's still a lot that we don't know, but because there are already sweeping decisions that are going to be made, we could have universities that are losing colleges, that are losing programs, and we might not get those back. And so you might not be able to get the same liberal arts education at a university that you used to be able to. And of course, I'll end on this note, we need state and federal government leaders who support truly public education. It's incredibly important that we have those people in government that believe that higher education is not a luxury but a need. We see all of these people who are on the front lines of the COVID crisis right now, the doctors, the nurses, the lab technicians, the researchers. You don't get any of those people unless you have higher education. And so we need to realize the role that higher education in Ohio has played before, during, and will play after this crisis. And we don't want to hamstring ourselves even further, because especially after an economic downturn like what we're experiencing right now, people turn to higher education to get a new degree and get new skills. And so we don't want to make these institutions even more expensive by defunding even further, because that will simply make it more costly for students to attend. So I will end at that. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to present today.
Thank you both for presenting. My name is Danny Carlson. I'm the Communications Director for the Center for Community Solutions. And first of all, I wanted to thank everyone for coming today and want to remind you, if you do want to ask a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A box or type it in the chat box, and we will make sure to ask them of our panelists. Want to open with the first question, and some of these were written when either Melissa or Sarah was talking, but a lot of them really have to, I feel like, are good to get the perspective from both of you. And this is one of those. Melissa, I'll pose it to you first, though. One questioner said some of European nations have reopened their schools. They're employing some of the very things you've discussed that may be used this fall in the US. Is it too early to know how well the European schools are doing so that we might be able to learn from them?
Thanks for that question. I think it's too early to know exactly what we can learn from them, but we certainly need to be keeping an eye on what they're doing, and we are doing that. But both OFT, AFT is watching that. We have very good relationships with the unions in other countries, so we've actually done some webinars and Zoom calls with union leaders from other countries to learn from what they're doing. And since they're opening sooner than us, we can watch and see what's happening. I know that ODE is also looking at what's happening in other countries. So we are fortunate in that way that we've got people who are stepping out ahead of us, and we do want to be able to learn from that.
And Sarah, I posed that question to you too. It seems like, I know I read today, I think that Oxford said that they were going to suspend or do virtual learning for the next year. I mean, are there lessons that higher education can also learn from European countries who might be doing things slightly ahead of America currently?
Sure, I think that, we'll certainly be looking to European universities and see what their plans are. It's just difficult because, of course, every country has handled the crisis differently, and some may have been quarantining and had stay-at-home orders longer, and so every situation is a little bit different. And places like Oxford, they have plenty of money to weather the storm, whereas a place like Bowling Green State University, which is my alma mater, doesn't have those kind of resources. And so, it's very difficult. And we, of course, want to make sure that our faculty and students are kept safe on campuses this fall if, we do reopen in any way, whether it be altogether or a hybrid model. But like Melissa said, I think it's still too early to see what's going to happen. But we just want to make sure that, we balance the safety issues with the financial issues, but certainly give more weight to the safety issues because we don't want campuses to become hotbeds.
Great. And on that note, Sarah, you kind of addressed another question that we've gotten from one of the attendees, talking about that it's terrible that 3 months universities have been shut down. And this person says, well, we've weathered wars. Why can't we weather this? Why is this impacting universities so much? And I'd like you to sort of comment on that, because this is, I know a lot of politicians have used this as a war fighting against this virus, but this does seem to be significantly different and a unique challenge.
Right. It is unfortunate. Well, like I mentioned in the presentation, really the COVID crisis hasn't caused the financial issues at our universities, but rather has exacerbated ones that have already existed. And so we've been dealing with enrollment declines at institutions for many years now. We've been dealing with, inadequate state funding. And so when you have a crisis like this that happens and you have to give millions in refunds to students, and you're uncertain about your enrollments for summer, fall, and even after that, then that becomes a very, difficult financial situation to weather. But as I've said, there are areas that have, sucked away money from academics. And so this is an opportunity for colleges and universities to get back to their core mission, because otherwise we're going to essentially gut academics at our colleges and universities. And, we don't need our universities to become simply a slate of administrators, with a football team. We need to do better than that right now.
Great. And then let me pose this question to Melissa and Daryl first. But again, Sarah, I'd like to get your input on it too. Can you comment at all on what schools might be thinking about to protect staff who may be in high-risk categories to contract COVID-19?
Yes, we've been putting a lot of thought into that, and we talked about this in our Senate testimony the other day. We know that a lot of our staff is either in a high-risk category themselves, or they live with people who are in a high-risk category. So that's why we're putting so much emphasis on safety and going back to school, because they're actually at higher risk than the children are themselves. So that's why things like the physical distancing, the precautions of taking temperature before school, wearing masks, etc. But taking that to another level, also looking at how can we make sure that whether as staff or students, can still participate in the education process without having to put themselves at risk. So for example, is it possible that we can have a classroom where the teacher might be in a high-risk category, so the students might be in the classroom being monitored by a paraprofessional or some other certified staff, but the teacher is teaching remotely from home. Same could happen for students, right? Where the majority of the students might be in the classroom, but there's a technology set up that would enable a student to access it from home. So this is just time to be really creative and thinking about how can we make sure the most number of people can participate in the system without putting their own health at risk.
And Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that from the higher education perspective?
Yeah, I think, one of the troubling things that we're seeing right now is a lot of staff at our, institutions of higher education are getting laid off. And it's a lot of, custodial staff, for example. And, we're thinking, well, who's going to keep our schools clean if we're lacking, these staff members? And then, of course, there is, the safety issue of, staff members who aren't, 22-year-old college students who are more susceptible to contracting this disease. And so, I think that we're carefully looking at what the CDC guidelines are. We want to make sure that the, health and safety of everybody in the campus community is taken into consideration when we're talking about possibly reopening for the fall. Like I said before, I think that probably some sort of hybrid model is going to be employed, but we need to make sure that, we're being as creative as possible to make sure that we're not losing too much money, and we're not going to be further hamstringing our colleges and universities. But again, we need to balance those with the safety concerns of everyone, from staff to students to faculty.
And another question for you both, starting with Sarah. You both touched on challenges that some students, some faculty may face as a result of digital learning. We all know of the digital divide in terms of those with low income not being able to access the same resources. Does this pandemic have the chance to just widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots? And what can be done to try to prevent that?
Yeah, I think that is certainly a possibility, especially when, you just don't have the access anymore. If students don't have the access to computer labs on campus, or they don't have access to public libraries. So I think that there are people who are trying to figure out, how we can do this. Like, I know that there have been some private businesses that have tried to expand, internet access, for example. And I think we need all hands on deck to make sure that students have what they need to be able to learn. Certainly faculty are willing to work with students who have other circumstances and make sure, but again, it's incredibly difficult to teach, especially large college courses online at all, as it is. But, with people who might not have that access, it is a real problem. And so I think that, the longer this goes on, you are going to see, I think, some different educational outcomes, depending on the digital divide.
Yes, and I would agree wholeheartedly with everything Sarah just said. I think this has raised a lot of ethical questions for educators through the shutdown. The question of how far along do we move learning when we know that our students who have the most challenges are the ones who also don't have access to technology? Do we continue to widen that gap by continuing with education, or do we do more of a review and make sure that we're focusing in on all the standards and making sure that what we've already taught this year just continues to get reinforced? And those are the questions we're going to have to keep considering moving forward, because there's no doubt that some students have better access than others. I think this is also really a strong case for internet access being considered as a necessary infrastructure for our state, because it's not even just students who don't have access. We've done surveys of faculty, staff, and there's places where they don't have access to this technology either. So it's just not even a possibility to do this in some places. So I think we have to double down on looking again on how do we provide internet access across the state, and how do we make sure that people then have devices, and then answer those challenging questions of, in places where it doesn't currently exist, how do we make sure that the education process is still equitable for everyone?
Great. Melissa, this question does seem to be more specifically for you. One of our attendees asked, were CARES Act funding for K through 12, and higher ed? So Sarah, also if you have any ideas on this, but were CARES Act funds for K through 12 and higher ed restricted to pandemic uses and not allowed to help backfill for budget shortfalls?
Well, I saw in the chat box that people were wondering when Daryl was going to chime in, and this is right up his alley. So I'm actually going to kick this to Daryl, who is my right-hand person at OFT, and let him answer this question.
Well, the CARES Act money for K-12 does allow for recovery of COVID-related expenses. It also does allow for paying staff so that you can maintain your staff as well. So there's a little bit of both in there, but more is needed as we go forward.
And in terms of higher education, I can say that for the direct aid that was given to colleges and universities, half of that was specifically for Pell students, and the other half was more of the unrestricted variety. And so, institutions immediately use that to, help fill those, holes from refunds that they had to give to students, as well as the budget cuts from the state.
Thank you both. This question also for the both of you, starting with Sarah. The pandemic has increased talk among some about regionalism and consolidation. Have any of the panelists heard any additional conversations about geographic consolidation with school districts, or within higher education with college consolidation as a mean to reduce those administrative costs? And then what are the pros and cons to having this conversation during this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we have heard some conversations about possible, sharing of resources or consolidating some programs. Like, so for example, Bowling Green is right down the road from Toledo. And there's already been talk, before the pandemic about possibly combining some programs and, some services and things like that to reduce costs. But I think it's probably too early at this point to know whether the pandemic and the financial fallout from it actually is going to necessitate things like that. The great thing about Ohio higher education used to be is that you could, drive 20 minutes, from your home anywhere in the state, and you'd have a higher education institution available to you. But then over the years, as the funding has declined, that's also been its greatest enemy, is that we have so many institutions, we have to fund so many. And so it will be an interesting question to see if some institutions, especially open access institutions that are hurting more than the selective ones at this time, decide that maybe now is the time to consolidate and try to have more regional institutions than have institutions that are 15 minutes from everyone. So it's still a very open-ended question, but an important question that I think we're probably going to hear a lot more about in the coming days and weeks.
On the K-12 side, I have not heard those particular conversations happening at this point in time. What I would like to offer, though, instead of thinking about how do schools consolidate, is to put out there, again, this community learning center model that we promote quite often, about how do we look at all the resources that are available in an area and make sure that they're all being made accessible to students. Because what we have seen during this pandemic, again, is that schools are not only just the education providers, but they're also the provider of meals. They're also the ones who are reporting violence, with, child abuse within a home, providing social services. And we've seen a lot of community partnerships formed during this pandemic where people are working together within the community to meet the needs of the students. That's actually the model that we promote for education every day, not just during a pandemic. How do we work with all our community agencies to provide for the needs of the students instead of everyone working within separate silos? So I think that this gives us an opportunity to look deeper at that type of collaboration again and figure out how do we formalize these relationships and start thinking about how do we bring all these services together in a way that's accessible to students and share these resources rather than working from silos.
Another question an attendee asked, why do you feel private schools don't need financial assistance? Melissa?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to answer that question. I don't think I said that they don't need financial assistance. I think the question is, should that financial assistance come at the expense of public schools? Our state has a constitutional responsibility to fund public education. And I recognize that some people choose to go to private schools for whatever they choose to go to private schools. But at a time when we're struggling to be able to maintain services for public education, it's detrimental to be pulling from that lack of resources already to give to private schools. 90% of the students in Ohio are educated in our public schools. And as I pointed out before, we've got schools in the state who are losing money. Again, I'll go back to Cleveland Heights. Cleveland Heights is a school that's majority minority school, okay? The majority of the population is some kind of minority. They lose an unbelievable amount of money to private schools that are primarily Jewish schools and Catholic schools, and over 80% of the students who take those are white students. So here at a time when we see that COVID-19 is having a disproportionate impact on communities of color anyway, now we also see that the schools where the majority of those students are attending are suffering losses to private schools. So I just think it's the state's constitutional responsibility to fund public schools. And if we get to a point that our public schools are very well funded and there's excess money, then maybe we can have the conversation about how do we fund private schools, but we're not at that point right now.
Daniel.
Sorry about that. Couple more questions coming in right at the end here. And again, if we don't have time to answer all of them, like Tara said, we will try to get them to the panelists. Let's see, this will probably be the last question, depending on time. One of our attendees has asked about saying California has canceled SATs and ACTs for the year. Do you know if there's any movement in either of these directions here in Ohio? Have any of the panelists heard any discussion of that?
Yeah, there have been some colleges and universities that already have announced that they are going to remove the requirements for ACT and SAT scores, but it's not been a uniform thing like some other state systems have done, so it has been done on a case-by-case basis to this point.
Okay, let's get one more question in. What other actions have other states taken that you would like to see Ohio mimic in terms of things like funding, planning, to any of the panelists for this one?
I mean, I can just say briefly about higher education. I mean, there are some states that generally have better funded their higher education systems over the years, and so they aren't in the dire straits that, you know, many Ohio institutions are in right now. I think that, you know, I don't think I've heard any states, you know, formally say that, you know, they're going to do one thing or the other, but I think, and I saw one of the questions that at a competitive disadvantage. And I do think that that's an important thing to do. And hopefully those conversations are happening among the institutions so that everybody can say, hey, we're doing the same thing. And so nobody's going to be at a disadvantage if, you know, one university is on campus and another isn't. So hopefully we can see some of that cooperation so that, you know, all of our institutions can succeed as much as possible during this time.
Great. And with that, we are coming right up to the 2 o'clock. So I will turn it back over to Kelsey and Tara. Thank you all again.
Thanks so much, Danny. And thank you to Sarah and Melissa and Daryl for your presentation and your insight. We really appreciate everything that you shared today. I think it was really helpful and informative. We, are continuing to evolve, and we'll continue to have lots of questions. So, as much as we still had a few questions left, and we'll try to get those out to our speakers and get responses back. But certainly, we will all be staying in touch as to how things move forward over the summer. I think we'll be learning a lot. I have my husband is a teacher, so I'm hearing how just on an individual district level, things are changing. New information is learned every day. So seems like that's a lot of what we're all experiencing right now. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to Advocates for Ohio's Future for partnering on these webinars. We really appreciate all that goes into pulling these together. We appreciate everyone's attendance, and we will see you next week. We will be covering housing and homelessness and how that has been particularly impacted by the pandemic. So have a good holiday weekend, everyone, and we will see you next week.